She was a ghost made of dust and desperation, a whisper of a woman tethered to the earth by two small, silent children. They stood at the edge of the railroad town, a place that had chewed up her husband and spat out his bones, leaving her with nothing but the shame of his debt and the hollow ache in her children's bellies. The townspeople saw her not as a widow, but as a burden. A piece of unwanted cargo left behind by the China trade. They called her the China doll, but the name was a cruelty, a sharp-edged joke, for she was porcelain thin and easily broken, and no one wanted to play with her. Her son, clutched her worn trousers, his face a mask of stoic hunger. Her daughter, Leanne, was a bundle of rags in her arms, too weak to cry. For 3 days, they had eaten nothing but the scraps she'd begged for, scraps that were now gone. Pride was a luxury she had shed like a heavy coat in the blistering sun. All that remained was the fierce, animal instinct to keep her children breathing. She saw him then, a man who stood apart from the jeering, sweating men of the town. He was the blacksmith, Silas. He was a mountain of a man, quiet and solitary, with hands calloused from the forge and a gaze that never lingered on anyone for too long. He moved with a purpose that frightened people. He did not boast, he did not brawl, he simply was. He was buying a sack of flour, his movements economical and sure. She watched him, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. He was her last chance. A terrible, desperate thought bloomed in the barren soil of her mind, a weed of an idea she could not pull. She took a breath that tasted of grit and failure, and walked towards him. The crowd parted around her, murmurs following her like flies. She stopped before him, blocking his path. He looked down, his eyes, the color of a stormy sky, meeting hers. They held no judgment, only a quiet waiting. She could not speak the words. They were lodged in her throat, a lump of shame. Instead, she gestured to Leanne, then to herself. Her voice, when it came, was a frayed thread. "I will belong to you," she whispered, the words stolen by the wind, yet she knew he heard them. "If my children get one meal tonight," she did not look at his face. She stared at the worn leather of his boots, waiting for the laughter, the scorn, the kick of dismissal. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. The town watched, holding its breath for the spectacle. He did not speak. He did not flinch. He simply shifted the sack of flour to his other arm, reached into his pocket, and placed a few heavy coins on the counter inside the mercantile. Enough for flour, for salted pork, for beans, for a future she couldn't dare to imagine. He then turned and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a gesture of ownership. It was an answer. An agreement. She had sold herself for a meal, and in the stony silence of his acceptance, she felt the first, terrifying flicker of something that was not despair. The journey to his homestead was made in a silence as vast as the prairie itself. He walked ahead, his broad back a shield against the setting sun. She followed a few paces behind, her children trailing her like shadows. And small hand was a permanent fixture in hers, while Leanne slept fitfully on her back, her small weight a familiar burden. Mai expected him to turn, to bark an order, to assert the rights he had just purchased in the town square. Every step was a fresh wave of dread. She had seen how men like him, men of this new, hard country, treated women who belonged to them. She had seen the bruises and the vacant eyes on the other wives in the railroad camp. But Silas did not turn. He simply walked, his pace steady, as if he were alone, as if the 3 ghosts trailing him were a figment of the evening light. His homestead was a small, solid cabin nestled against a stand of cottonwoods, a testament to a life built with hands and sweat. A curl of smoke rose from the stone chimney, suggesting a fire already laid. He pushed open the door and stood aside, holding it for her. The gesture was so unexpected, so contrary to the transaction that had brought them here, that she froze on the threshold. Inside, the cabin was one large room, spare but clean. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs sat in the center, and a narrow bed was pushed into a corner. But to her right, sectioned off by a thick wool blanket hung from the ceiling, was another space. He gestured towards it with his chin. "For you," he said. His voice was rough, like stones rolling in a riverbed. It was only the 3rd time she had heard it. She pulled back the blanket. Behind it was a small cot and a pallet on the floor. It was a room of their own. A space that was separate. Her breath caught. She had expected to be sent to his bed, a continuation of the day's humiliation. Instead, he had given her a sanctuary. He went to the hearth, stoking the embers and adding fresh wood. He unpacked the provisions from town, his movements efficient and unhurried. He did not look at her. He did not watch her as she settled the children on the pallet, their small bodies finally relaxing in the warmth. He worked the flour and water into a dough, his large hands surprisingly gentle. He sliced the pork and dropped it into a skillet, the sizzle filling the quiet cabin with a sound so rich, so full of life, that tears pricked Mai's eyes. When the food was ready, he served it onto 3 tin plates. He set one before her, one by En, and one by Lian, who was now awake and watching with wide, dark eyes. He served himself last, and sat at the table alone. He ate without a word, his gaze fixed on the fire. She fed her children first, watching them devour the food with a desperate, heartbreaking speed. Only when their bellies were full and they had curled together on the pallet, fast asleep, did she allow herself to eat. The stew was simple, but it was the most profound meal of her life. It tasted of safety. When she was done, she gathered the plates, intending to wash them. He was already there, at the wash basin. He took the plate from her hand, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting second. The touch was like a spark on dry tinder. He did not seem to notice. He washed. He dried. He put everything away. Then he turned to her, his face shadowed in the flickering firelight. "What is your name?" he asked. "Mai," she whispered. He nodded once, a slow, deliberate motion. "Mai," he repeated, as if tasting the word, committing it to memory. He did not call her woman, he did not call her doll, he called her by her name. And in that simple act, he began to piece back together the woman she thought she had lost forever. The days bled into weeks, and the weeks into months. The harsh sun of summer softened into the golden light of autumn. A rhythm established itself in the small cabin, a silent dance of 2 solitary people learning to share a space. Silas would rise before the dawn, the quiet sounds of him stoking the fire and preparing for the forge her gentle alarm clock. He would leave a pot of oatmeal warming by the hearth for her and the children before he left for his workshop, a separate, soot-stained building a short distance from the cabin. He never asked for anything. He never demanded her presence or her labor. He simply provided. He would return at dusk, his face streaked with grime, his body weary. He would bring with him whatever he had managed to hunt or trade for that day, a rabbit, a brace of quail, a sack of potatoes from a neighboring homesteader. He would place it on the table without a word, and she would take it and prepare their evening meal. The silence between them changed. It was no longer the tense, fearful silence of the first night. It had become a comfortable quiet, a shared space where words were not needed. She learned the language of his movements. A slight dip of his shoulder meant he was tired. The way he flexed his hands meant the forge had been hard on him. A long look towards the horizon meant he was worried about the coming winter. She began to heal in that silence. The constant knot of fear in her stomach slowly began to unravel. Her children, too, began to thaw. Anne, who had been as quiet as a field mouse, started to explore the world outside the cabin door. Lian, whose cries had been thin and weak, now gurgled and laughed. They watched Silas from a distance at first, small, wary creatures. But he paid them no mind, which was the greatest kindness he could have shown them. He did not try to win them over with false smiles or loud overtures. He simply existed, a steady, predictable presence in their chaotic young lives. One evening, he came back from the forge not with food, but with 2 small objects clutched in his large palm. He opened his hand for the children to see. Lying on his calloused skin were 2 perfectly carved birds, their wings outstretched as if in mid-flight. They were swallows, crafted from a light, smooth wood, every tiny feather etched with impossible detail. He offered one to Anne and one to Lian. They hesitated, looking to their mother for permission. She nodded, a lump forming in her throat. The children took the birds, their small fingers tracing the delicate carvings. It was the first gift they had ever received. Later that week, she found another object lying on her cot. It was a comb, carved from the same light wood. It was not ornate, but it was beautiful, its teeth perfectly spaced, its back smooth and curved to fit a woman's hand. There was no note. No explanation. There did not need to be. She held the comb, the wood warm against her skin, and understood. He was not just providing shelter. He was building a home. He saw her not as a servant he had bought, but as a woman who deserved beautiful things. A woman with hair to be combed. A woman with children who deserved toys. She began to contribute in her own ways. She found his mending basket, full of torn shirts and worn trousers, and began to stitch them with neat, almost invisible seams. She found a small patch of earth behind the cabin, broke the soil with a rusty hoe, and planted the seeds she had carefully saved from their meals. A small garden of her own. It was a quiet rebellion. A declaration that she was not just a temporary resident, but a planter. A grower. A creator. A partner in this life he was building. She was planting roots in the rich, silent soil of his kindness. The first snows of winter came, blanketing the prairie in a sea of white and isolating them completely. The world shrank to the four walls of the cabin, the smoky forge, and the path between them. It was during this time that the final walls around Mai's heart began to crumble. Leanne fell ill with a fever that raged for 3 days and nights. Mai sat with her constantly, bathing her forehead with snow-melted water, trying to coax spoonfuls of broth between her cracked lips. She was terrified. In her old life, a sick child was a death sentence. There was no medicine, no help, only the cold pity of neighbors who had already marked the child as lost. Silas did not offer empty words of comfort. He acted. He kept the fire roaring, a constant, defiant blaze against the cold. He brewed a bitter tea from willow bark, an old remedy he knew for fevers, and held the cup for Mai while she administered it to Leanne. For 3 nights, he did not sleep in his own bed. He sat in the chair by the hearth, a silent, sleepless guardian, watching over them. He would rise every few hours to add wood to the fire, his movements a quiet reassurance in the dark. On the 3rd night, when Leanne's fever finally broke and she fell into a deep, healing sleep, Mai was utterly spent. She sagged against the wall, her body trembling with exhaustion and relief. Silas rose from his chair. He walked to her, and for the first time, he initiated a touch that was not accidental. He placed his large, warm hand on her shoulder. It was not a gesture of intimacy, but of profound, grounding support. "She is strong," he said, his voice a low rumble. Like her mother, he looked at her then, truly looked at her, and in his gaze, she did not see a frail china doll or a desperate woman who had sold herself. He saw a fighter. A survivor. He saw her strength. And in being seen that way, she finally began to see it in herself. The next day, when the worst of the storm had passed, 2 men on horseback appeared, their forms dark against the snow. They were lawmen from a town further west, hunting a fugitive. They were loud, arrogant men, their voices an intrusion in the quiet world of the homestead. They demanded shelter and food, their eyes lingering on Mai with a familiar, dismissive leer. "You keeping company, Silas?" one of them sneered, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Didn't take you for the type." Silas said nothing. He gave them food, as was the custom of the frontier, but his silence was a wall they could not breach. Mai served them, her head bowed, the old fear coiling in her gut. But as she moved around the cabin, she could feel Silas's presence behind her, a steady, unmovable weight. He was watching the men, his gaze flat and hard. The men, unnerved by his silence and his sheer size, ate quickly and left, eager to be away from the oppressive quiet of the cabin. When they were gone, the silence they left behind was different. It was charged. That evening, as she sat mending a shirt by the firelight, he spoke. "You are not a servant here, Mai." She looked up, surprised. "This is your home. If you wish it to be." It was not a question. It was a statement. A gift. More valuable than food, more valuable than shelter. It was the gift of choice. She looked at her sleeping children, their faces peaceful in the warm glow of the fire. She looked at the sturdy walls of the cabin that had kept them safe. And she looked at the quiet man who had asked for nothing and given her everything. "This is my home," she said, her voice clear and steady. And for the first time since she had left her homeland, it was the truth. Spring arrived like a promise fulfilled, melting the snow and turning the prairie green. The garden Mai had planted began to sprout, tiny green shoots pushing their way towards the sun. The children, now healthy and bold, played outside from dawn till dusk, their laughter the new music of the homestead. The life they had built was quiet, stable, and uniquely their own. But the past has a long shadow, and one day, that shadow fell across their doorstep. A wagon appeared on the horizon, moving slowly towards the cabin. It was not the wagon of a friendly neighbor. It was a foreman's wagon, and sitting atop it was Mr. Henderson, the railroad boss from the camp that had consumed her husband. He was a man made of loud talk and cheap cruelty, a man who believed the world and everyone in it owed him something. He had heard rumors of a China woman living with the reclusive blacksmith and had come to investigate, to reclaim what he saw as abandoned railroad property. He pulled the wagon to a halt, kicking up dust, and swaggered towards the cabin, two of his lackeys trailing behind him. "Well, well," he boomed, his voice slick with contempt. "Look what the prairie dog dragged in. I've been looking for you." He did not look at Silas. His eyes were fixed on Mai, a predatory gleam in them. "Your debt's not paid. You belong to the company." In the past, those words would have shattered her. She would have shrunk, trembled, made herself small and invisible. But the woman Henderson was speaking to no longer existed. That woman had been buried under the kindness of a quiet man and the rich soil of a new home. Mai straightened her shoulders. She did not lower her eyes. Beside her, Silas moved to stand just behind her left shoulder. He did not speak. He did not reach for a weapon. He simply stood there, a mountain of silent resolve. His presence was a declaration, "You will have to go through me." Henderson faltered for a second, thrown off by her lack of fear. "I'm talking to you, girl," he spat. Mai took a step forward. Her voice, when she spoke, was not the whisper he remembered. It was as clear and as hard as river stone. "My name is Mai," she said. "I do not belong to you. I do not belong to your company. My husband's debt was paid with his life. I owe you nothing." Henderson's face turned a blotchy red. He was not used to being defied, especially by a woman he considered less than human. "You think this hermit can protect you? I'll drag you out of here myself." He took a step forward, his hand reaching for her. Before his fingers could touch her, Silas moved. He did not strike. He simply shifted his weight, placing himself squarely between Mai and Henderson. He was taller, broader, and radiated a kind of primal stillness that was far more menacing than Henderson's bluster. He looked down at the foreman, his grey eyes cold and flat. "She said no," Silas said, his voice dangerously low. The two words hung in the air, absolute and final. There was no room for argument. Henderson looked from Silas's unyielding face to Mai's defiant one. He saw the two children peering from behind their mother's legs, no longer looking starved and fearful, but healthy and protected. He saw the tended garden, the solid cabin, the undeniable truth of a life that had been built here. He saw that he had no power in this place. His cruelty, his threats, his sense of ownership, they were meaningless noise in the profound silence of this homestead. With a curse, he turned, climbing back into his wagon. "You'll regret this," he shouted, a hollow, pathetic threat. But as the wagon rattled away, kicking up a cloud of angry dust, Mai knew they wouldn't. She watched it disappear, feeling not triumph, but a deep, quiet peace. The last ghost of her past had been exorcised. She turned and looked up at Silas. He was already looking at her, and in his eyes, she saw a universe of respect. He had not fought for her. He had stood with her while she fought for herself. He had given her the space to find her own voice, and now, it was the strongest thing she owned. A year later, the homestead was an oasis of life on the vast prairie. The garden overflowed with vegetables, and a small pen held 2 goats and a handful of chickens. The swallows Silas had carved sat on the mantelpiece, silent guardians of the hearth. Inside the cabin, the blanket that had once divided the room was gone. There was only one space now, one home. On a warm summer evening, Mai sat on the porch steps, shelling peas into a wooden bowl. And Anne and Leanne were chasing fireflies in the twilight, their laughter like bells in the soft air. Silas sat beside her, sanding a new axe handle, the rhythmic scrape of the tool a comforting sound. Their life was a tapestry woven from quiet moments like this. He had never spoken words of love. He did not need to. Love was in the solid roof over their heads, in the food on their table, in the way he looked at her children as if they were his own. Love was in the comb he had carved for her hair and the unwavering belief he had in her strength. He loved her not in spite of her scars, but because of the resilience that had earned them. He finished his work, setting the smooth handle aside. He watched the children for a moment, a rare, soft smile touching the corners of his mouth. Then he turned to Mai. He reached out and covered her hand with his own. His palm was rough and calloused, but his touch was gentle. It was a gesture of simple, profound belonging. Not the belonging of ownership she had once offered in desperation, but the belonging of a shared heart, a shared life, a shared home. She looked at their joined hands, hers small and delicate, his large and strong, and she knew she was finally, truly, safe. She was not the china doll. She was not a burden. She was Mai. A mother. A gardener. A survivor. A woman who had been seen for who she truly was, and loved for it. She was home. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on The Wanderer's Journal. If you had been in that town and seen her desperation, would you have been the one to offer a hand instead of a judgment? Tell us in the comments.